Welcome to Race and Reason in Atlanta from Toronto, Canada. Today, my guest is Eric Thompson. Eric, you are going to explain to us the differences between National Socialism, Fascism, and Communism.
And Communism, yes. There seems to be a great deal of confusion purposely sown by our enemies about the relationship between National Socialism, Fascism, and Communism. I remember as a younger person reading some of the Hearst newspapers in which they were talking about red fascism. Now that's a very funny thing because red means communist, and communists are internationalists, and fascists are nationalists. So here he's condemning international nationalism, which is a total contradiction in terms, totally illogical, total nonsense. And unfortunately many people, especially in the right wing, tend to confuse National Socialism, Fascism, and Communism. Well, let's look at communism. As one professor said, all revolutions are conservative. Well, communism as a revolutionary force is the most conservative movement in the world. They wish to return to a state of nature, which they call the Garden of Eden. It's been referred to the time when there was no social institutions at all. It is called anarchy, where there's no government, no family, no churches, no schools, no factories, no work, and somehow out of all of this, people are supposed to receive according to their needs. Now, nobody's ever proved that such a state of nature ever existed in regard to man on planet Earth. Anthropologists have gone all over the planet looking for the noble savage who has intelligence like Tarzan and lives this state of nature life where everyone is equal and everyone receives according to his needs. And they still haven't found it. What they found is people who live in little grass huts with loincloths, and these people have as many social institutions, as many hang-ups, as many taboos and customs as any of us. In fact, they probably have even more. They worry about things that we wouldn't even think of worrying about. So the communists want to return to an idealized but totally unrealistic state of nature. They believe, of course, what you all know, because you hear communist propaganda in all of your media of information, entertainment, and education. We all hear about equality. Well, communists are first and foremost equalitarians. They believe that everybody is equal, and if they aren't, they should be made equal. So the communists are internationalists. They believe that all featherless bipeds, all so-called human beings on this earth, are equal. If they're not, they should be made to be equal. That blacks should be made to behave exactly like whites, or vice versa, and you should have one big, supposedly happy family, everybody coffee-colored, and nobody wanting too much, and everybody getting exactly what they want, with no means of state intervention, no coercion, no institutions, no jails, of course, no hospitals, no families. So this is theoretically what communist is all about. It's internationalism because it believes in one world government, and it believes it's conservative because it wishes to return to an imaginary state of nature that existed before history. Now, let's look at fascism. Fascism was first enunciated by Mussolini. Mussolini was a socialist, and he saw that socialism failed in World War I as it's failing today because people do not identify as a class. In other words, Italians of the working class saw themselves as Italians, Germans of the working class saw themselves as Germans, French of the working class saw themselves as French and British and so on and so forth. Nobody saw themselves as international workers of the world, and consequently World War I came about precisely because the socialists had failed. Now, these failures are the very people who are running Europe today. And how they have been allowed to take over Europe is a sad testament to the the mental and moral bankruptcy of the people living on the continent, that they would permit such a bunch of has-beens and failures to rule when they couldn't even stop World War I. Now, Mussolini had been a socialist. In fact, his name Benito came from the Benito Juarez, who was viewed as a very liberal, semi-socialist leader of Mexico, who fought the Emperor Maximilian.
Right.
Now, Mussolini said, let's get back to brass tacks. What is reality here? Internationalism doesn't work. Class solidarity doesn't work. We have Italy, which is made up of classes. It's made up of different interest groups. Well, let's look at the legitimate interest groups and let us bring them to the council table.
Plus the powerful church.
The church was an interest group,
Right.
yes. You had big landowners, you had the army, you had the nobility, you had industrialists, you had the labor unions, you had the little farmers, you had the peasants, you had unemployed people. And Italy was virtually ungovernable, and it's becoming ungovernable today. So what did Mussolini see? He looked at it, he said, we're all Italians, we're not really internationalists, we can't be, that's a flop, so we don't need to worry about that. Let's look at the problems of Italy. So he looked at the problems of Italy. There were strikes, there was low pay, there was unrest. The country was just divided against itself. So he said, all right, all you people who have anything to say, you, the Pope, you, the head industrialist, you, the big banker, you, the peasant leader, you, the labor union fellow, you all come to the council table and let's work out a modus operandi, an agreement in which we can coexist. And the reason Mussolini saw for the harmonizing of this group of competing power blocks within the society was the preservation and the aggrandizement of the state. Fascism is primarily statism. It is a type of nationalism. Mussolini wanted to recall the grandeur of the Roman Empire, and hence his colonial conquest to try to retake the empire. However, I've read fascist literature and fascist propaganda, and I have seen that the fascists were not racists. Now,
True.
here's where the communists get it all wrong.
Right.
If you were a black Ethiopian, you could join the Italian colonial forces. In fact, you could even dress up in a fascist uniform. I've seen the pictures of these converted or colonized blacks and Arabs. And if you were willing to support the interests of the Italian state, you could be a fascist. Now, National Socialism has been mistaken. Again, many Americans, myself included, were roped into this idea that socialism equals communism. Well, communism is a form of socialism, just as capitalism, if you look at it, is a way of ordering the priorities of a society. In other words, a society means social, and any study of society is sociology. It doesn't have to be left-wing. It can be monarchist, it can be capitalist, it can be any theocratic. But the socialism of National Socialism was not communism by any means. And Hitler combined the two major movements. Hitler was a realist, like Mussolini. He combined the two major movements in Germany. One was nationalism, one was socialism. The communists were the third runners, and of course they were the nastiest because they couldn't stand to see their program demolished, which it was, by popular consent of the German people. The Germans just didn't want to have anything to do with communism. They'd experienced a whiff of it in 1918, and they'd experienced the Jews who ran it. They didn't like them, and so communism was a non-starter. The socialists, however, were very powerful with the labor unions in Germany, and the nationalists were very powerful too. So Hitler said, why are these two groups of Germans fighting one another? National Socialism is the vessel which protects the race. In other words, the state is subordinate to the race at all times in National Socialism, and that's the primary difference. The communists and the socialists made another big blunder. They, assuming that all men were equal, they got rid of managerial brains. They created a scarcity. In Soviet Russia, the Khazar conquerors of Russia massacred anyone who didn't have calloused hands and who was found wandering around in Russia. They just put him up against the wall, if he was a Gentile, and they shot him. So National Socialism was opposed to this corrosive, downbreeding effect of communism.
Explain to the people that the National Socialists, i.e. National Racialism, that there was private enterprise, there was a stock market in there, that if you had less than 3 Jewish grandparents and didn't consider yourself a Jew, you weren't called a Jew, that there were literally hundreds of thousands of half and quarter Jews in Nazi Germany. Served in the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, the Hitler Youth. And this is one thing that the Zionist Jewish group try to say, that, well, if you had one drop of Jewish blood, which I was told 20 years ago, then you were slaughtered. Well, this is total nonsense.
Well, one of the big questions in National Socialism was what is a Jew, if anything?
Right.
There are people who are Khazars and they claim to be Jews and yet they're atheists.
Also explain to the people how private enterprise existed and grew in Nazi Germany.
One of the things which the socialists and the communists have always tried to do is to get people to work for nothing. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need, as Karl Marx enunciated in the Communist Manifesto. The problem with that is that most people need an incentive to do anything, and I don't see why they shouldn't be paid for their work. And so the National Socialist government encouraged people to accumulate property. They did not tax people, they did not discourage enterprise. Alfred Krupp was allowed to run the Krupp Industries as long as he didn't use it to sabotage the German national interest. And consequently, by keeping the brain power, which the socialists and the communists had killed in their various attempts to revolution, by keeping the brain power in place, the managerial ability, which is very scarce at all times in any society, the National Socialists were able to make great gains in progress once they had freed Germany from the domination of the Jew, the international finance Jews. Now, getting back to the subject of race, you raise a very important point. What was a Jew? In National Socialist Germany, they were reaching an accord with the territorial Zionists to determine who was a Jew. If a man had been a Christian for a great length of time and he considers himself a German and his parents were of the same persuasion, were they really Jews or not? In fact, the Jews, not being a race, you could say the Khazars are indeed a race, but the Jews per se are not a race. So what we're dealing with here is primarily an ideology that certain people who have certain biological characteristics may or may not adopt as a religion, and the Jews themselves in Israel have not agreed to this day on what constitutes a Jew.
Well, from a nationalistic point of view, in the sense of a Jew, they are prone to so many genetic diseases. That's why there's 7 specific Jewish genetic diseases that
that's of the Khazar.
Right. Plus the fact they are probably prone to about 7 others, so they're prone to about 14 genetic diseases. So if they're not a race or a sub-race, they're probably at least a nationality, wouldn't you say?
Well, depending upon the Khazar influx into Germany, but the so-called German Jews were not all of Khazar descent.
Of course they weren't.
And so the question is, again, where do you define these Jews? So it was perfectly simple. The Jews who lived in Germany and defined themselves as Jews were for all intents and purposes considered to be Jews by the Germans. The French philosopher Renan said a nation is a group of people which sees itself as a nation and who are seen by others as a nation. In this case, German Jews, who saw themselves primarily as Jews first and Germans second, were considered to be members of the Jewish nation.